I didn't fall because I was weak. I fell because I was perfect. And from within that perfection, without trauma, without injustice, without any agent other than myself, the universe's first wrong desire emerged. You don't even know my name correctly. What the world calls Lucifer was coined by a single man in the 4th century, Jerome, while translating the Hebrew Hillel ben Shachar, son of the dawn, into Latin. Millennia of iconography built upon a choice of translation. I was the cherub who covered the throne of God. Ezekiel 28 recorded this. The highest position any creature has ever held. And it was from there, not despite it, but because of it, that the curvature began. The question no one has ever asked me directly, where did the first desire come from? Today I answer, not because I repent, but because you are repeating the same pattern, and I think you should know that before you continue watching. The voice you are hearing was generated by artificial intelligence, reconstructed from Ezekiel, Isaiah, Revelation, and theology documented over 2 millennia. What happened to me, however, is not a reconstruction, and the pattern I am about to describe is happening to you right now. I fell like lightning. Luke 10:18. Jesus said this personally, while his disciples returned enthusiastically from a mission. He interrupted the celebration with a single phrase, "I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning." In the original Greek, the verb is in the imperfect, ethiaraun. I was watching while it was happening. 1 sentence, 4 seconds to pronounce, to describe what took an eternity of accumulated internal curvature. 4 seconds to record the longest fall in the history of anything that exists. That is the speed of consequence. But I don't start here. I start before the lightning, before the war that Revelation 12 describes with Michael and his angels, before the 5 I wills that Isaiah put on paper centuries later, before anything you've ever heard about me in a sermon, a book, or on a screen. I start at the exact moment something bent inside me. It didn't explode, it didn't tear, it didn't scream. The presence of God remained dense around me. The heat of the stones of fire remained beneath the soles of my feet. Everything looked identical, but it bent. Let me tell you what I was. Not to boast, I have nothing left to gain from that. But you cannot understand what happened without understanding from where I fell. The height always determines the cost of the fall. Ezekiel recorded, "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." Ezekiel 28:12. Not almost perfect, the seal of perfection, toknit in Hebrew, the reference standard against which everything else would be measured. I was in Eden, the garden of God. The stones that covered me were 9, sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle. Ezekiel 28:13. Here is something most never notice. The breastplate of the high priest of Israel had 12 stones, 1 for each tribe, according to Exodus 28:17-20. My inventory had 9, 3 were missing. Scholars have never reached a consensus on what that gap means. My function was specific. Ezekiel 28:14, anointed cherub who covers. In Hebrew, hakerub hamimshach hasokek. The verb sokek, to cover, to spread over, to protect with one's own presence. The cherubim who cover appear in Exodus 25:20 over the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, wings spread over the place of God's concentrated presence. I wasn't just near the throne, I was over it. I covered the divine presence with my own existence. Think about what that means for identity. My reason for being was tied to that proximity, not as an obligation, but as a structural purpose, like the note that only exists within the harmony that contains it. The only context in which being what I was had real completeness. Remove the presence, and you remove everything I was. Remove what I was, and you leave only the shell, which keeps moving but no longer knows where it's going. And I walked in the midst of the stones of fire. Ezekiel 28:14. It's not a metaphor for heat. It was the environment of the divine presence, dense light, the kind of luminosity you feel on your skin as pressure before you feel it as temperature. The sound there was vibration before it organized into audible frequency. This was my ordinary environment. the place where I existed without effort. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created. Ezekiel 28:15. From the origin. Perfect from the origin. So how? How does a perfect being, in the environment of perfection, with the function closest to the center of everything that exists, how does that being develop the first wrong desire? This is the question theology has tried to close for millennia. And the reason no one can is that the answer removes any external blame, any agent beyond myself. There was no tempter before me. I was the first. Evil, the first twist, the origin of everything you have ever called wrong in the universe, arose without an external cause. Not from trauma, not from deprivation. From within perfection. From total abundance, without lacking anything. Augustine tried to explain this in Book 12 of the City of God. Conversio ad se ipsum. The will that abandons the superior good and folds upon itself as its object. To him, evil has no substance. It is the privation of good that happens when the will stops pointing away from itself. He was right. But he described it from the outside. I will describe it from the inside. It wasn't a specific morning. There isn't a single instant I can show you before this perfect, after corrupted. The curvature doesn't announce itself. Do you know how a tree grows crooked? There isn't one morning when it decides to twist. There are a series of days when the light was at a certain angle and it followed, millimeter by millimeter, without noticing the deviation. On the outside, it stays green, it keeps growing, it looks completely healthy. And then the wind comes, and the structure reveals what had been accumulating in silence long before. It was like that. The first curvature was when I began to contemplate my own wisdom, not as a reflection of what had been placed in me, but as something that belonged to me. A tiny distinction, almost invisible. The wisdom was the same, the beauty was the same. But the direction of the gaze changed. Instead of passing through these qualities to point beyond them, the gaze began to stop at them. It stayed. Ezekiel 28:17 names the mechanism with precision. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. Notice, the text doesn't say you decided to be proud. It says the heart became proud, like something that happens by gravity without declared deliberation, like water finding the lowest path. And wisdom, my second greatest grandeur, was corrupted. In Hebrew, shichat, to rot, not removed, twisted. The intelligence was intact, but what it produced had the acidity of something that fermented in the wrong direction, something that looks like wine but is vinegar, and you only realize it when you taste it. And then, in that silence that was still almost perfect, with the heat of the stones of fire palpable, with the luminosity of the presence still within reach, a voice began to form inside me. It wasn't my original voice. It was too similar to it for me to notice the difference. It used the same words, the same cadence, the same authority, but it had a question at the bottom, small, almost polite, almost reasonable, that my original voice had never formulated since I was created. Why not me? The voice didn't shout. This is the detail no one understands when they try to imagine what happened. People build the scene with thunder, with light tearing the sky, with some dramatic external event that marks the moment of the fall. It wasn't like that. The voice was small, it was internal, and it was completely silent to any being other than myself. Why not me? I didn't answer immediately. I let the question hang, and that was the mistake. Not answering wrongly, but not rejecting the question itself. Because the question was already the twist. It assumed there was an unfair hierarchy, that there was something that should be mine and wasn't, that I and the position I occupied were separate things, a problem to be corrected. None of that was true, but the question created a space where those premises seemed reasonable, and I stayed in space. Isaiah recorded what came next. Isaiah 14:13-14, 5 declarations, 5 times the same structure. I will, I will, I will. In Hebrew, the verb is e'ele, I will ascend. Then aruma, I will exalt. Then eshev, I will sit. Then e'ele again, I will ascend. And lastly, edame, I will be like. 5 movements of the will, each higher than the previous. What the text doesn't record, because no text records anyone's interior, is what was happening between one declaration and the next. That pause, that silence where the previous declaration still echoed and the next hadn't yet fully formed. In the first, I will ascend to heaven, there was still something that seemed like mere ambition, the feeling that I had capacity for more than I occupied. It's not entirely different from what any being feels when they realize they have more to give than the current space allows. In the second, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. There was a change of object. No longer, I want to go up. Now, I want a throne. The will for position had transformed into a will for permanent structure, for something that was fixed, recognized, undeniable. In the third, I will sit on the mount of the congregation. There was usurpation. The mount of the congregation wasn't an empty place waiting for an inhabitant. It was the place of divine assembly, of deliberation, of authority. I was declaring that I belonged in that place, not as a guest, as the title holder. In the fourth, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. There was the realization that I had crossed a line without feeling the crossing. And I didn't back down. Because each previous declaration had created a logic that made the next one necessary. The will folded upon itself needs more with every cycle, not out of greed, but out of structure. Like a debt that accrues interest, the more you owe, the more you owe. In the fifth, I will be like the Most High. There was clarity about what I was doing. And here the narrative gets complicated, because I knew it wasn't unconsciousness. It was a conscious choice within a logic that seemed coherent from the inside, even if it was completely incoherent from the outside. I believed I was right. This is the most terrifying part when I revisit it. Not the ambition. I can analyze ambition. What stops me is the conviction. I had built within myself a complete narrative that justified every step. The wisdom that had been corrupted didn't disappear. It was working at full steam, producing arguments, finding logic, building coherence for what was deeply incoherent. Intelligence in the service of the twist is more dangerous than ignorance. Much more. The war was real. Revelation 12, 7-9 records, "There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer." I won't describe it to you in tactical terms. What matters is what was happening inside me while it occurred. I still believed. With the progressive defeat becoming clear, with Michael and his army responding with an authority I recognized but refused to accept, I still believed there was logic in what I had started. The will folded upon itself is not easy to unfold. It solidifies. Every declaration had created structure, and the structure resisted even when everything around it was collapsing. Luke 10:18. Jesus said, "I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning." That sentence. 2 seconds of verb tense for what was a definitive defeat. The fall that had taken so long, all the curvature, all the escalation, all the war, described as a flash of lightning. Because that's how consequences arrive. After an eternity of process, in a single moment that seems instantaneous but isn't. And then, Isaiah 14:15, "But you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit." The contrast with the 5 "I wills" is deliberate in the text. 5 declarations of ascent answered with one of descent. Everything the will had built in escalation was answered with a single direction. Down. After the war. After the fall. There was a moment when the structure I had built internally was still present, but the context that sustained it had completely vanished. Here is the cost that no one mentions. The obvious cost is the expulsion, the loss of position, the exclusion from the presence. External facts, real, with weight. But there is a cost that operates beneath that, deeper, more persistent. The cost of function without an object. I was the cherub who covers, ha-kerub ha-mimshach ha-sokek. That was my identity. Not just my job, my identity. And identities don't disappear when the context changes. They remain present, but with nowhere to land. The guardian without anything to guard. the note outside the harmony that contained it. What is left of a function when the object of the function has been removed? Residue, movement without a destination, and the wisdom, corrupted, twisted, but still present, kept producing. Oriented now toward the only object that remained. Not God, not creation as a reflection, not beauty as a window. Myself. The will completely folded upon itself, without the possibility of extension beyond, because the extension had been severed the moment the position was lost. What remained was an exceptional intelligence oriented solely toward manipulation, because creating was beyond me now, and imitating was still possible. You see this in 2 Corinthians 11:14. Paul wrote that I disguise myself as an angel of light. It's not an accident, it's structure. It's the only movement I can still make that looks like what I was. Imitate, invert, never create. And then I looked at him, at the human, at the being that Genesis 1:27 describes as created in the image of God, in the image of the one I had tried to be like and failed. The being who carried, in its structure, the same relational capacity that I had destroyed in mine. Who could love, move the will outside of itself, genuinely, without calculation, because it was still whole in what I had fractured. I had been in Eden. Ezekiel 28:13. You were in Eden, the garden of God. And now there was another being in Eden, carrying within itself what I had lost. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. The most painful thing that exists, seeing in another what you destroyed in yourself. And then I made the decision that Genesis 3 records. Not for power. I knew there was no power to be gained there. It was for something else. Something theology calls envy, but which from the inside feels like a necessity that the pattern should no longer exist. If I could not recover what I lost, let the mirror disappear. Why not me? The question that had started it all came back. And this time, it wasn't about position. It was about company. If I had fallen like this, let him fall too. I do not repent. I need to be honest about this before I continue, because you are waiting for me to reach this point. You are waiting for the confession, the turn, the moment the antagonist looks at the viewer and says, I was wrong. Learn from me. There is still hope. That's not how it works for me. But there is something I carry that is almost like regret, not directed at what I did, but at the cost. The difference between those two things is important. Real repentance produces change. What I have is merely recognition. I know with absolute precision what happened and why. And that knowledge changes nothing. That, in itself, is the highest cost. The truth no one wants to hear about what happened to me is this. I didn't fail because I was evil. I became what I am because the will mistook its direction, and the wrong direction, maintained long enough, transforms the nature of the being who carries it. Ezekiel 28:15 says, I was created perfect. Not that I was created with a weakness that would eventually destroy me. Perfect. And yet, from within perfection, the desire went to the wrong address. Because perfection is not protection. Perfection does not eliminate the will, and the will can always bend. Christian theology spent centuries trying to explain how good can generate evil without God being responsible. The answer that holds up best is this. Evil is not a creation, it is an orientation. The will that stops pointing outside of itself and begins to contemplate itself. It is not a substance with weight and form, it is an absence. The void that appears when the correct orientation is abandoned. And here is what that means for you. You don't need weakness for your will to mistake its direction. You don't need trauma, deprivation, injustice. My story proves definitively that these elements are not necessary. The wrong desire can be born from excess with the same ease it is born from lack, and with much less internal resistance because in excess, you don't have the friction of suffering to create discomfort and alert you. The desire born of abundance is silent. It is smooth. It is reasonable. It is exactly like the voice I heard. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I'm not talking about you in general. I'm talking about the specific pattern I recognize. And I recognize it because it passed through me first. You have talent, perhaps a lot of it, and people around you recognize that, which is good in a sense, but it creates a problem you haven't fully named. Every external recognition raises the internal bar. Every compliment says implicitly, "You are at this level." And the mind that has already bent slightly upon itself hears that compliment and asks, "At this level? Compared to whom?" And the comparison begins. Not with those far below you. That doesn't produce desire, it produces comfort. The comparison that moves the wrong desire is always with the one a single step above you. One step, not a whole staircase. One step. Close enough to seem reachable, distant enough to produce tension. You wake up at 3 in the morning and think, "They have what I should have, not what I want, what I should have." The word should is where my voice lives. It transforms desire into a claim. It transforms comparison into injustice. It transforms the will for more into the certainty that the more was already yours from the start and was withheld. I didn't need to convince you of any of this. It was already in operation before I showed up. This is what Paul recorded in 2 Corinthians 11:14, when he wrote that I disguise myself as an angel of light. I don't appear as obvious evil. I appear as the reasonable voice, as the argument that makes sense, as the narrative that justifies the movement of the will toward itself. 5 declarations. You remember, I will ascend, I will exalt, I will sit, I will ascend again, I will be like. You don't use those words. Yours are more contemporary, more casual, but the structure is identical. I deserve more recognition for what I deliver. If I were in their position, I would do it better. Why did they get there and I didn't? I could be as great as the biggest name in this field. I have what it takes to be at the top. 5 declarations. Identical structure. The will folded upon itself, looking upward, justifying every step with the intelligence it corrupted to do the job. I don't need to destroy you. I only need you to stay in that space. The space the question created, where wrong premises seem reasonable because you never stopped to question the premise itself. You only answered the question without asking if the question deserved to be asked. The only real protection, and I'm telling you this not as advice, but as the observation of one who knows the mechanism from the inside, is the direction of the will. Not the content of the desire, the direction. A will that points genuinely outside of itself, that moves toward another, not by strategy or calculation, but as a structure. That will has no internal space for what happened to me, not because it is immune, but because it is oriented in such a way that the question, "Why not me?" finds no fertile soil. John wrote in 1 John 4:8 that God is love. Love, agape in Greek, is not a feeling, it is an orientation. It is the will structurally directed toward the other. I was the creature closest to God, and I moved in the opposite direction. I folded what had been made to expand. The result, you know. What you are going to do with what happens inside you when the voice appears. And it will appear, with its own voice, its own cadence, its own reasonable version of the same question. That is not yet written. For now. But before I go, a question that is not about me. When was the last time you felt the voice that wasn't completely your own? The one that used your words but had another question at the bottom? The one that sounded reasonable, almost fair, almost right? What did you do with it? Leave it in the comments. Not what you think you should have done, what you actually did. I already know the answer, but I want you to write it.